Sigmund Freud publishes The Interpretation of Dreams. In Vienna, the rise of the expressive art of Gustav Klimt, Egon Schiele, and Oskar Kokoschka coincides with the emergence of psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud declares in the epigraph to The Interpretation of Dreams, in the quote, "If I cannot move the higher powers, I will stir up hell." With this passage taken from the Latin epic poem Aeneid, Sigmund Freud intended to picture the efforts of the repressive instinctual impulses. And right here, we might think lies the connection between this intrepid explorer of the unconscious and such brazen innovators in Viennese art as Gustav Klimt, Egon Schiele, and Oskar Kokoschka, for they too seem to stir up hell in the early years of the century through a liberatory expression of repressed instincts and unconscious desires. These artists did stir up hell, but it was no simple liberation. Unrestricted expression is rare in art, let alone in psychoanalysis, and Freud would not have supported it in any case, as he was a conservative collector of ancient Egyptian and Asian artifacts. He was wary of these modernist artists. The connection between these four Viennese contemporaries is better drawn through the notion of the dream work developed by Freud in the interpretation of dreams. According to the epochal study, a dream is a rebus, which is a puzzle or a broken narrative in images, a secret wish struggling to be expressed, and an internal censor struggling to suppress it. Such a conflict is often suggested in the most provocative paintings by Klimt, Schiele, and Oskar Kokoschka, which are frequently portraits. A struggle between expression and repression in sitter and painter alike. Perhaps more than any other modernist style, this art places the viewer in the position of psychoanalytic interpreter. Although Paris is more celebrated as a capital of modernist art, Vienna witnessed several events that are paradigmatic of turn of the century avant-garde. First was the very act of secession, the withdrawal from the Academy of Fine Arts in 1897 of a group of 19 artists, including Klimt, and architects, including Joseph Maria Olbrich and Joseph Hoffmann, into an order of its own, replete in this case with its own building. In opposition to the old academic guard, the secession advocated the new and the youthful in the very names of the international style that it had adopted, which was called Art Nouveau in French and Jugendstil in German, literally yacht style. Also typical of the avant-garde was that this advocacy provoked great scandal. First, in 1901, the University of Vienna rejected a Grimm painting on the subject of philosophy that it had commissioned from Klimt, who responded with a second painting on the subject of medicine that was even more outrageous. Then, in 1908, the School of Arts and Crafts expelled Kokoschka after a performance of his lyric drama of passion and violence, Madara, the Hope of Woman, the first banishment in his long nomadic life. And finally, in 1912, the authorities charged Schiele with kidnapping and corrupting a minor, jailed him for 24 days, and burnt many of his sexually explicit drawings. These controversies were not staged for bourgeois titillation. They pointed to genuine rifts between private reality and public morality in Vienna at the time. For the new art emerged as the Austro-Hungarian Empire was collapsing, it was symptomatic of the crisis of the liberal ego in the old order, as suggested by historian Karl E. Skorsky. Here lies a further connection with Freud. More than a liberation of the self, this art attests to a conflict within the individual subject regarding its threatened authorities, the academy, and the state. In Freudian terms, the superego that surveys us all. A crisis of culture characterized by an ambiguous combination of collective Oedipal revolt and narcissistic search for a new self, again suggested by Skorsky. This crisis was hardly punctual or uniform. Differences existed not only between the cessation and the academy, but also between the expressionist aesthetic of young painters such as Schiele and Kokoschka and the art nouveau ethos of cessation artists such as Klimt, who advocated a total work of the arts or Gesamtkunstwerk. This Gesamtkunstwerk was exemplified by the Palais Stocklet in Brussels, designed by Hofmann in 1905 to 1911, with arboreal mosaic murals created by Klimt. The Cessation was divided internally as well. In its craft studios, it promoted the decorative arts, which other modernist styles often suppressed. For example, Klimt used such archaic media as tempera and gold leaf as well as mosaic. On the other hand, in its expressive use of line and color, the cessation also encouraged modernist experiments in abstract form. In this way, it was caught up in contradiction in style between figuration and abstraction, in mood between fin de Chile Malay and early 20th century Joie de Vivre. And this conflict tended to be evoked in the edgy, almost neurasthenic line that Klimt passed on to Schiele and Kokoschka. In these tensions with the Art Nouveau style of the cessation, the great German critic Walter Benjamin later glimpsed a basic contradiction between the individual basis of crafted art and the collective basis of industrial production. Here, what he says is the transfiguration of the lone soul was the apparent aim of Art Nouveau. Individualism was its theory. With the Belgian designer Henry van de Velde, there appeared the house as expression of the personality. Ornament was to such a house what the signature is to a painting. The real significance of Art Nouveau was not expressed in this ideology. It represented the last attempt at a sortie on the part of art imprisoned by technical advance within her ivory tower. It mobilized all the reserved forces of interiority. They found their expression in the mediumistic language of line, in the flower, a symbol of the naked vegetable nature that confronted the technologically armed environment. If Art Nouveau represented a last sortie on the part of art, the cessation signaled its full embrace of the ivory tower, as exemplified by its white building replete with floral facade ornament and grille dome, intended by its designer Olbrich as a temple of art which would offer the art lover a quite elegant place of refuge. Thus, even as the cessation broke with the academy, it did so only to retreat to a more pristine space of aesthetic autonomy. And yet, in a further contradiction, the cessation took this autonomy to be expressive of the spirit of its time, as announced by the motto inscribed beneath the dome: to each age its art, to art its freedom. Here is, as art historians in Vienna might have said at the time, the very artistic will or Kunstwollen of this new movement. The first president of the Viennese session was Gustav Klimt, whose career passed from the historical culture of the Austro-Hungarian Empire through the anti-traditional revolt of the avant-garde at the turn of the century to an ornamental portraiture of Viennese high society after this modernist revolt appeared to him at least to be rooted. His father, an engraver, had sent him to the School of Arts and Crafts, from which he emerged as an architectural decorator in 1883, just as the monumental buildings of the central Ringstrasse of remolded Vienna came to completion. His early works included allegorical paintings for two new Ringstrasse buildings, a painting of dramatic figures, including Hamlet, for the ceiling of the City Theatre. It was in 1886 to 1888, and a painting of cultural representatives, including Athena, for the lobby of the Museum of Art History. It was in 1891. In 1894, on the basis of these successes, the new University of Vienna commissioned him to produce three ceiling paintings representing philosophy, medicine, and jurisprudence, respectively, on the Enlightenment theme of the triumph of light over darkness. Klimt worked intermittently on the project for the next 10 years, exhibiting the first painting philosophy in 1900. By this time, however, he was caught up in the secession, and the finished painting was hardly what the university had in mind. Rather than a pantheon of philosophers, Klimt represented an anguished passage of commingled bodies through an amorphous space, overseen by an obscure sphinx in the center and a luminous head which evoked Medusa more than Athena at the bottom. In this world, darkness seemed to triumph over light. If Klimt questioned rationalist philosophy in this commission for the university, he mocked therapeutic medicines in the next, unveiled in 1901. Here, medicine is represented as yet another hell, with even more bodies, some slung in sensuous slumber, others mashed with cadavers and skeletons, a grotesque phantasmagoria of the unity of life and death, the interpenetration of instinctual vitality and personal dissolution, as said by Skorsky. An even stronger slap in the face of the university, the painting was again rejected and Klimt rebuked. His rejoinder was to rework the final representation of jurisprudence into one last hell of criminal punishment, with three large, intense furies around an emaciated man, all naked in a dark space below, and three small, impassive graces gowned in a hieratic space above. These allegorical figures of truth, justice, and law hardly assist the male victim who, surrounded by octopus tentacles, is at the mercy of the three furies of punishment. One sleeps obliviously, one stares vengefully, one winks as if on the take. Here, punishment appears psychologized as castration. The man is gaunt, his head bowed, his penis near the maw of the octopus. In a sense, it is this constricted man whom Schill and Kokoschka will attempt to liberate, though in their art too he will remain broken. His very defiance was tinctured by the spirit of importance. Skorsky writes of Klimt, This is true of Schill and Kokoschka as well. These failed commissions signaled a general crisis in public art at this time. Clearly, public taste and advanced painting had parted company. For the most part, Klimt then withdrew from the avant-garde in order to paint realistic portraits of stylist socialites, ornamental people, set against ornamental backgrounds. His withdrawal left it to Schiele and Kokoschka to probe repressed instinctual impulses, and they did so in the guise of often anguished figures stripped of historical reference and social context. To look at his figures, Schiele once remarked, is to look inside. Skeptical of the decorative refinements of Art Nouveau, both Schiele and Kokoschka turned to post-impressionist and symbolist painters for expressive precedents. As in other capitals, retrospective exhibitions of Vincent van Gogh and Paul Gauguin were influential, as were secession shows of the Norwegian Edvard Munch and the Swiss Ferdinand Hodler. Having grown up in a bourgeois family of railway officials, Egon Schiele met Klimt in 1907 and soon adopted the sinuous, sensuous line of his mentor into his own angular, anxious mode of drawing in the 10 years before his death. He produced some 300 paintings and 3,000 works on paper in bloody reds and earthly browns, pale yellows, and bleak blacks. Schiele attempted to paint pathos directly in melancholic landscapes with blighted trees, as well as desperate pictures of aggrieved mothers and children. More notorious are his drawings of adolescent girls, often sexually exposed, and his self portraits, sometimes in similarly explicit positions. If Klimt and Kokoschka explored the reciprocal relation between sadistic and masochistic drives, Schiele probed another Freudian pair of perverse pleasures, voyeurism and exhibitionism. Often he stares so intently into the mirror at us that the difference between his gaze and ours threatens to dissolve, and he seems to become his only viewer, the solitary voyeur of his own display. But for the most part, Schiele does not seem defiantly proud of his self image so much as pathetically exposed by its damage. Consider his nude self portrait in grey with open mouth. The figure recalls the emaciated victim of jurisprudence turned round and made younger. He has broken free, yet free he is broken. His arms are no longer bound, they are amputated. Less an angel in flight, he is a scarecrow pinioned and cut at the knees. His slight asymmetry skews other oppositions as well. Although male, his penis is retracted and his torso is more feminine than not. With rings around his eyes, his face resembles a death mask, and his open mouth could be interpreted equally as a vital scream or as a deathly gaping. This self portrait seems to capture the moment when vitality and mortality meet in neurotic morbidity. This transformation of the figure is primary legacy of Viennese art at this time. It might seem conservative in relation to other modernist art, but it provoked the Nazis to condemn it as degenerate 30 years later. Well past its service as classical ideal and social type, the figure here becomes a cipher of psychosexual disturbance. Without direct influence from Freud, these artists developed a sort of symptomatic portraiture that extended Van Gogh's expressive renderings of people, a portraiture that evokes less the desire of the artist than the repressions of the seeker, indirectly through tics and tensions of the body. Here, what the attenuated, often emaciated line is in Klimt and Schiele, The agitated, often scratched line is in Kokoschka, a sign of a torturous surfacing of subjective conflict. Also influenced by Klimt, Oskar Kokoschka developed this symptomatic portraiture farther than Schill, and he probed its disruptive dimension farther too, to the point where he was forced to leave Vienna altogether. During his troubles, Kokoschka was supported by the modernist architect and critic Adolf Loos, already notorious for his austere designs and fierce polemics, and the 1909 Kokoschka portrait of this great purist could be said to capture their partnership of opposites, similar to the Schill self-portrait in stylistic respects, down to the ringed eyes. The painting evokes a subjectivity that is nonetheless quite different. The clothed Luz gazes inward. He is composed, but one senses he is under great pressure. Indeed, rather than expressed or pressed outward, his being seems compressed and pressed inward. Self possessed in both senses of the term, he reigns in his energies with an intensity that seems to deform his wrung hands. A year before the portrait was painted, Luz had published his diatribe against the Ars Novum of the Secession, titled Ornament and Crime. It might as well have read Ornament is Crime. Luz deemed ornament not only erotic in origin, but excremental as well, and though he excused much immorality in children and savages, the man of our day who, in response to an inner urge, smears walls with erotic symbols is a criminal or a degenerate. Not coincidentally, in this land given the excremental nickname Cacania by the novelist Robert Musil, Freud published his first paper on character and anal eroticism in 1908 as well. Yet, whereas Freud wanted merely to understand the civilized purposes of this repression of anal erotic drives, Luz wanted to enforce them. A country's culture can be assessed by the extent to which its lavatory walls are smeared, he wrote. The evolution of culture is synonymous with the removal of ornament from utilitarian objects. Luz was not sympathetic to psychoanalysis. His friend and compatriot, the critic Karl Kraus, once called it the disease of which it thinks it is the cure. But like Freud, Luz did imagine the anal as a messy zone of indistinctness, and this is why he implied that the applied arts of the secession and the violent outbursts of expressionism were excremental. Against such confusion, Luz and Cross demanded a self critical practice in which each art, language, and discipline would be made ever more distinct, proper, and pure. We do well to remember that Vienna was the home not only of such disruptive painters like Klimt, Schill, and Kokoschka, but also of such disciplinary voices as Luz in architecture, Cross in journalism, Arnold Schoenberg in music, Ludwig Wittgenstein in philosophy, who once wrote that all philosophy is the critic of language. Already at the beginning of the century, then we find in Vienna an opposition fundamental to much modernism that followed, an opposition between expressive freedoms and rigorous constraints.